In November of 2014, Washington, D.C. passed Initiative 71, a referendum approved by 70% of voters to legalize marijuana in the district and to allow the D.C. Council to create a regulated marketplace for its production and sale. In a city where African Americans make up roughly half the population, yet account for 90% of marijuana arrests, this was a pretty big deal for social justice. That is, until one guy decided that it was not a very good idea. Because Congress is given full control of DC's budget, both federal and locally raised dollars, Andy Harris was able to add a rider to the $1 trillion Cromnibus spending bill to prevent the law's implementation. Thankfully, our council and our mayor stood up to Congress, and they declared that legalization took place the day that we voted for it at the ballot box. But to this day, we are still federally barred from creating rules to regulate and tax marijuana in the district. To add insult to injury, because we are not considered a state, our only representative in Congress wasn't even allowed to vote on the bill. Now, as a native Washingtonian, watching this play out was extremely frustrating, to say the least. Many of my neighbors took to Andy Harris's Facebook page to express their displeasure, which was not only inspiring, but at times pretty funny as well. But in practical terms, there was no real impact. At the end of the day, he still gets to go back to his very conservative district and coast to re-election without facing any consequences for his actions. But then I had an idea. If politicians in Washington don't care about our votes, if they don't listen to our phone calls and emails and letters, what's the one thing that they do care about? Money. Now, unlike many of you here, I am far from a professional political operative. I've always followed politics, but in college I studied computer science, and now I work in a restaurant. But I also realized something needed to be done. So after many hours of research and a surprisingly small amount of paperwork, I created my very own super PAC, the Not Your District Political Action Committee, with the goal of holding members of Congress accountable when they interfere in our local affairs. I started throwing happy hours around DC, and the response was overwhelming. People started finding me and emailing me, asking how they could help and volunteer and be a part of it. I started networking with existing organizations in DC, like DC Vote, who's here. And before long, I had a pretty amazing team of advisors and volunteers who are poised to have a very real effect on the upcoming election cycle. Now, since the creation of my PAC, there have been no shortage of attacks on DC's laws. In March of 2015, Representative Jim Jordan of Ohio and Senator Marco Rubio of Florida introduced a measure to effectively gut DC's gun laws. That same month, Ted Cruz introduced a bill to remove protections for LGBTQ communities on our college campuses. And in April, for the first time in almost 35 years, the full House voted along party lines to formally strike down one of DC's laws. The law in question, the Reproductive Non-Discrimination Act, which simply says that your employer can't fire you for using birth control or getting an abortion. Luckily, these were largely symbolic gestures, as they would ultimately require President Obama's signature. But with the latest appropriation bill, the threat is very real. Once again, Congress is attempting to use budget riders to force these policies upon us, along with continuing bans on marijuana regulation, needle exchanges, or public funding of abortion. These are democratically enacted laws passed by our elected representatives, who members of Congress that we have never voted for are attempting to overturn just because they disagree with our politics. Now, Not Your District PAC is ready to stand up to the bullies in Congress. That means educating their voters back home about what exactly their congressperson is doing on their behalf in Washington, and also running hard-hitting ads that highlight the hypocrisy of politicians who claim to revere states' rights and local control, but have no problem using the power of the big government to trample on our local democracy. But we also recognize the fundamental root of the problem, that our almost 660,000 residents are treated as second-class citizens, locked out of the legislative branch of government that ultimately decides our fate. The sad fact is that until DC is recognized as a state and given full representation in Congress, progressive policies in our nation's capital will live under constant threat of congressional overreach. So, our hope is to use electoral victories in 2016 to push the statehood movement over the top, but we also need you to stand with us. And that means calling your congressman, your senator, and letting them know that you believe every American deserves a voice in our democracy, no matter where they live. Thank you.